My ancestor Sereth Ondevil did not call Earth. I want to be precise about that, because in the years since the convoy arrived, the accounts have softened and rearranged the sequence of events in ways that give her credit she would not have claimed for herself. They describe a woman who made a deliberate choice in a desperate hour, who recognized that the old frequencies ran deep and that somewhere out there, something might be listening on the ancestor band, and who chose to cast her message in a direction she could not see. They give her foresight. They give her strategy. They give her the quiet confidence of someone who understood what she was doing. What she actually did was cry. She sat at her desk on the 417th day of a siege, and she cried into a frequency that had been dead for 4 centuries. And she cried in the ancient notation system that her grandmother's grandmother had used for the same purpose, which is to say, she cried in a language that no living civilization was supposed to be able to hear. And Earth was listening, because Earth had built infrastructure for exactly that kind of grief, and they had never seen a reason to stop running it. And the signal traveled 412 years and landed in the queue of a comms officer who was working the early shift with a cup of coffee going cold on her console, and who had the good sense to plot the coordinates before she filed it as anomalous. That is the story. But a story requires context, and the context requires me to go back further, so I will. I am Sereth Ondevil. I hold the same chair that Sereth held, the governor's chair of the Vethrani protectorate, which I came to by the customary combination of appointment, confirmation, and the grinding administrative apprenticeship that has been the tradition of this office since before my birth. I am the 4th Ondevil to sit in this chair. Sereth was the first, and she held it for 31 years under conditions that would have broken most people, and she did not break. I have kept her records since I took the chair, because keeping the records of everyone who sat here before you is the obligation the chair carries. I have read everything she wrote. I have read the official session logs and the procurement authorizations and the damage assessments she countersigned without changing her expression, and I have read the private journal she kept throughout the siege, which the archive holds under a classification marker that means personal, not for official use, preserved because it is part of the record even when it is not official. I have had years to think about what all of it means, and I have had the particular advantage of knowing how it ended, which Sereth did not. And I think what it means is this. The galaxy is older than anyone's intentions, and the old frequencies carry the weight of what was sent on them long after the sender has moved on, and sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, the right ears are positioned at the right distance to receive what was never intended for them. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me begin where Sereth began, which is at a desk, in the dark, with the weight of an ongoing disaster pressing on every flat surface in the room. The Vethrani protectorate entered the 3rd year of the Orsith siege in a state of deliberate calm that had long since stopped resembling actual calm. I know this from the session logs, which are precise and thorough and notable for what they do not contain, which is any suggestion that the woman signing them was under extraordinary strain. Sereth Ondevil conducted her governing council meetings with the same procedural formality she had used before the siege began, when the Protectorate's greatest administrative challenge had been a water rights arbitration in the outer settlements that had taken 3 years, and produced 11 volumes of documentation and resolved, ultimately, in favor of the downstream consortium, a result that had satisfied almost no one. She filed her reports. She signed her authorizations. She received damage assessments from the orbital defense platforms and countersigned them without changing her expression, because she had determined, and this is in the private journal, in her own hand, in a passage that is somewhat difficult to read because the handwriting is uncharacteristically cramped, as though she was pressing hard into the page, that the expression of despair was a luxury the office could not afford, because if the governor despaired, the council would despair, and if the council despaired, the administrative staff would despair, and at the end of that sequence was a collapse she was not willing to participate in. The siege had begun with a demand. The Orseth hegemony wanted access to the deep core relay station on the second moon of Vethrani Prime. The relay held navigational mapping archives that predated the Protectorate itself, surveying data for this entire sector going back to the original colonization period. What the data was worth to the Orseth, Sereth never fully established, though she spent considerable administrative energy attempting to do so. What she did establish in the first months of the siege was that what the Orseth were willing to do to obtain, it was bounded only by what they calculated they could do without triggering an intervention from outside parties, and that calculation was proving generous. The Vethrani were not a military civilization. That is not a euphemism or a polite way of saying they were weak. It is a precise statement about the way the Protectorate had organized itself over the preceding 3 centuries, following the end of the last major conflict in this sector, following the signing of the Corinth Compact, following a long and deliberate decision by several generations of governors that the resources that had gone into the old defense fleet would be more productively allocated elsewhere. The Vethrani had decommissioned most of their warships. They had maintained the orbital platforms because the orbital platforms served civil functions as well as military ones, and because even the most thoroughgoing anti-militarist administration recognizes that a planet with no outer defense is making a statement it may not be able to sustain. They had also, on the theory that alliances were preferable to unilateral capability, joined the Corinth Compact, which was a mutual defense arrangement of 17 systems, and which had, on paper, formidable combined fleet assets and a treaty obligation that ran to collective response in the event any member faced external aggression. The Compact had sent 2 liaison officers. Sereth records her response to the arrival of the liaison officers in the private journal rather than the official record, which is characteristic of her. She was careful about what she put in the official record. In the official record, she notes the arrival of the Compact representatives, their credentials, and the initial meeting in 3 lines of clear administrative prose. In the private journal, she writes 4 pages about it, and the 4 pages are not kind, though they are fair. The liaison officers were not bad people. They were not, as she writes, fools. They were people who had been sent to do what their government was willing to do, which was to observe and to express concern and to facilitate communication. And they were aware of the gap between what they had been sent to do and what the situation required, and they were handling that awareness about as well as could be expected, which is to say not especially well. She quotes the senior liaison officer, a man named Verath Essek, a different Verath, no relation to the Endeavor line, on the subject of compact fleet availability. He had said, with visible difficulty, that fleet assets were currently committed elsewhere in the Compact's area of responsibility, and that the situation at Vethrani Prime was being monitored closely, and that the Council of the Compact had expressed its deep concern. He had said that the duration and intensity of the siege had been noted at the highest levels. Sereth had said, "How long?" He had said, "Governor." She had said, "How long before the closest available compact fleet assets could be repositioned to this system if the Council decided to authorize deployment?" He had said, with what she describes as the expression of a man who has been asked a question he was hoping to avoid, "The assessment is that it would require between 4 and 6 months, pending Council authorization." Sereth records that she thanked him for the information and moved to the next item on the agenda. She writes in the journal that night, 4 to 6 months pending authorization. The authorization will not come. The other 16 members of the Compact are calculating the cost of intervention against the cost of precedent, and the cost of precedent will win because it always wins. They always are. The assets are always committed elsewhere. She was not wrong. The outer settlements were taking the worst of it. Sereth does not write much about the outer settlements in the private journal, which I have come to understand as a specific kind of record keeping, the kind where you manage the unmanageable by not writing it down where you have to look at it. She writes around the outer settlements. She writes about the supply chain disruptions and the infrastructure damage assessments and the displacement totals and the requests for subsurface shelter allocation. And then she moves to the next item. And if you have read enough administrative records to know what they look like when something is being managed by omission, you can read what she is not writing. The orbital platforms were holding. The deep core relay was intact, sealed behind a defense configuration that Sareth had authorized in the first week of the siege, and which had cost them one of their 3 platform commanders to set up. The inner settlements were operating in subsurface shelters. The administrative infrastructure was intact. The session schedule was maintained. On the 417th day of the siege, the Orseth fleet moved against the second orbital platform. This had been anticipated. The platform commander, a man named Decoded, had been forecasting the movement for 6 weeks in his regular situation, reports to the governor's office, with the careful, undemonstrative precision that characterized his reporting throughout the siege. He had noted the Orseth fleet's maneuvering patterns, the gradual repositioning of their forward elements, the timing windows that would favor an approach to the second platform's defensive arc. He had requested additional resupply for the platform's defense systems in the weeks before the engagement. Some of the resupply had been possible, not all. Decoded fought for 12 hours. The official record of the engagement is detailed, and Sareth approved its language personally, which means it is precise about what happened and restrained about what it cost. The platform's automated systems performed beyond design specifications. The crew responded with professionalism. The defensive configuration held longer than any actuarial assessment of its durability had suggested it would. At the end of 12 hours, the platform was gone. Decoded was gone with it. Sareth writes about Decoded in the private journal. She writes about him at length, and I will not quote that passage here. It is hers, and it is not mine to give, and it belongs to her, not to this account. What I will say is that she had known him for 11 years, since before the siege, since a time when the possibility of a 12-hour engagement that ended in the total loss of a platform and all its crew was a contingency plan in a document no one expected to use. The paragraph that follows the one I will not quote is the relevant one. She writes, "We have sent 14 formal distress requests through the Compact's official channels. We have sent 9 to the Outer Sector Assembly. We have sent 3 to the High Table of the Courant Alignment. None of them have produced material aid. The Compact's liaison officers will continue to express deep concern. Tomorrow I will hold the session and review the supply assessments and countersign the damage report and move to the next item on the agenda. That is what I will do tomorrow. Tonight I am going to do something different. I am going to sing the Rendezvous passage for the dead, which is what my line does when we lose someone we cannot afford to lose, and the formal record is not enough to hold the weight of it. I am going to put it on the ancestor band, because that is where it belongs, and because if there are gods or ancestors or anything or anyone out there that listens to what is put on the ancestor band, I would like them to know that Decoded died, and that we are still here, and that we have been here for 417 days, and we have not broken. And then tomorrow I will hold the session." The ancestor band was not a communications frequency in any functional sense. It was the liturgical channel the Vethrani had used for longer than anyone living could accurately date, going back to the ceremonial traditions that predated the Protectorate and the systems that ran the Protectorate and the civilization that had built those systems. It was the frequency of the Rendezvous passage for the dead. It was the frequency of the declaration of ongoing life, which was the counterpart to the passage, the rite that said, "We are still here, we are still counting our days, we mark the names of the dead so that the living can continue." It was not on any routing table maintained by any living civilization. It was not, as far as any Vethrani administrator or comms technician would have told you, received by anyone or anything. Broadcasting on it was the formal equivalent of speaking into a room you knew was empty. The act had weight and the act had meaning, and the weight and the meaning were entirely self-contained, because there was no one there to receive them. Sareth took the portable hymn encoder from the cabinet in her office, where it had sat since her installation as governor, which was the traditional ceremony in which the outgoing governor, or the governor's heir, transfers the instruments of office to the new occupant. The hymn encoder was one of those instruments, a compact device in a casing of dark polished material with a keypad rendered in the ancient notation system, the one that predated the modern Vethrani script by several centuries. She sat at her desk. She encoded the Ondavel passage for the dead in full liturgical format, following the notation system exactly as the tradition prescribed, because she had learned it correctly as a child, and because doing it correctly mattered even when, especially when, you were doing it for an empty room. She added the declaration of ongoing life, which was the part of the rite that said, "We are still here." The traditional form of the declaration included the name of the settlement and the date of reckoning, counted from the founding of the protectorate. She added Vethrani Prime and the siege count, 417 days, which was not the traditional form but which was, she clearly felt, the most accurate form. At the end, in the same ancient notation, she added the coordinates of Vethrani Prime in the astronomical marking system, the ancient notation used, not the modern navigational format, but the old positional notation derived from visible star triangulation, which any sufficiently ancient surveying system would recognize. And she added Deseth's name, in full, in the formal three-part notation the tradition used for the dead. She broadcasted on the ancestor band, and set the hymn encoder back in the cabinet and went back to the reports. She did not think about it again. There is no mention of it in the journal after that night. There is no wondering whether it was received. There is no private hope that something might answer. She sent it to an empty room. She received the empty room's silence, and she returned to the work the office required. The next day's journal entry begins. Session convened at the 8th hour. Supply assessment for inner settlements reviewed. Platform 1 Commander Ravit submitted damage analysis for the northern array. Countersigned. She held the session. She moved to the next item. She did not break. The signal traveled. All signals travel. That is the nature of signals. You send them and they move outward from the point of transmission at a fixed rate, and they do not stop unless something stops them. And space is very large and mostly empty, and there is very little to stop a signal sent in the right direction on the right frequency. Sareth's signal was sent in no particular direction, because the ancestor band was not directional. It was a broadcast, cast outward equally, the way a stone cast into water sends rings in all directions. It traveled through the outer atmosphere of Vethrani Prime and out past the orbital platforms, and through the debris field of what had been the second orbital platform and out into the dark and kept going. It kept going for 412 years. At the far end of those 412 years, at the edge of the Terran Commonwealth's established listening range, the signal arrived at a relay station called, in Terran administrative records, the Pre-Diaspora chaplain-comm array, Outer Station 7. Outer Station 7 had been in continuous operation since the early period of human expansion into this sector, which predated the Commonwealth's current administrative structure by a considerable margin. It had been built during a time when human settlements in this region were scattered and vulnerable, and the question of whether they would survive had not yet been answered conclusively. And during that time, the humans had developed their own tradition of sending grief into the void. They called their frequency the chaplain band. The nomenclature was historical. Chaplain was the old word for the institutional functionary responsible for the spiritual welfare of a community or a crew, and the chaplain band had originally been the frequency reserved for the ceremonial transmission of the dead, the declaration that a loss had been marked, the broadcast that said, "This person was here, this person died, we are noting it." The Terran chaplain band and the Vethrani ancestor band were not the same frequency. They were built by different civilizations in different eras using different engineering conventions. But they were close in the way that two different instruments hit the same harmonic when tuned to intervals derived from the same mathematical ratios, which is to say they were close because the mathematics underlying the acoustic design of grief does not vary much by species. When you are designing a frequency for the dead, you tend to work from similar constraints. The range must carry, the signal must be readable at distance, the format must be simple enough to use under conditions of distress. You end up in the same neighborhood. Outer Station 7 received Sereth's broadcast. Its automated decoding systems identified it as non-hostile, which was the first filter. Its pattern recognition array parsed the notation system, which was not in the array's primary library, but which shared enough structural markers with the Terran chaplain band format that the array flagged it as a close match rather than an unclassifiable anomaly. The array identified the ancient positional notation at the end of the transmission and processed the coordinates, which resolved cleanly to an inhabited system in this sector that was, as of the Commonwealth's most recent survey data, under active siege by an external aggressor. The array logged the signal as priority forward and transmitted the full package signal capture, decoded notation, coordinate plot, pattern analysis, to the Commonwealth Sector 7 comm station, where it arrived in the incoming queue of comms officer 3rd Class Alina Dross, on the early shift, with a cup of coffee going cold on her console. I know about Alina Dross in considerable detail, because she was on the convoy when it arrived at Vethrani Prime, and she was the one who sat across from me at the table in this office, and explained, with patience and with precision, what Outer Station 7 had seen in Sereth's signal and what she had done with what she had seen. She was, by the time we met, Senior Comms Officer Dross, twice promoted in the period between the morning she flagged the signal and the day the convoy reached Vethrani Prime. She was a compact woman, not tall, with gray at her temples and an economy of expression that I recognized as the particular economy of someone who had spent a long career in a profession where precision was not a preference but a survival requirement. She told me that she had almost filed the signal as anomalous and moved on. A 400-year-old broadcast in an unregistered notation system from a species that had no record of contact with the Commonwealth was not, on its face, an actionable matter. She told me she had been about to file it when she decided, largely out of professional habit and not out of any particular instinct, to plot the coordinates. She said, the broadcast was 400 years old. That means whoever sent it had sent it without expecting it to reach anyone. But the coordinates were current. They resolved to an inhabited system with an active conflict flagged in our most recent survey update. Which meant one of two things. Either the conflict had been running for 400 years without external resolution, or this broadcast was not the only one that had ever been sent, and whoever was sending them had been sending them for a long time without ever reaching the right receiver. She paused, she said, both of those are distress conditions. The notation had structural markers consistent with a distress format. I didn't know it was liturgical yet, that came later from the archivist review. But the structure of the signal, the way it was organized, the coordinates, the duration count, those are the things you include when you're telling someone where you are and how long you've been there. That's what a distress call is. She had submitted the dispatch request inside the hour. She told me with a dry candor I had come to appreciate, spent the next 2 weeks in a state of oscillating certainty. Certain she had done the right thing, then certain she had generated a significant volume of paperwork for a 400-year-old liturgical transmission, and would shortly be required to explain herself to a review authority that would find her explanation inadequate. She had not been required to do that. The dispatch had been approved at the sector authority level without significant delay. The 3rd Sector Relief Convoy, 2 supply carriers, and a medical transport, with a naval escort frigate attached as a precautionary measure given the active siege designation, had left port under the command of Senior Logistics Officer Harun Yas before the end of the same week. The convoy was already underway before the Vethrani knew it existed. I was 7 years old when the convoy arrived. My memories of the siege itself are fragmentary and organized around the particular sensory details that a 7-year-old retains. The sound of the displacement alert, which I heard so many times in those years that I still respond to a similar tone, with a brief, physical tightening that my body performs before my conscious mind has time to consider what the tone actually was. The smell of the subsurface shelters, which was the combined smell of recycled air and the particular cleaning agent the civil maintenance staff used on the floors, a smell that is associated in my memory with a particular kind of dull, patient waiting that is distinct from the acute fear that comes with immediate danger. The way adults looked at each other over the heads of children in the moments after a new alert, the particular vocabulary of adult faces conducting a rapid calculation about how much information to convey and how much to withhold. I remember the day the convoy arrived because it interrupted that particular texture of waiting and replaced it with something I did not immediately have language for. The displacement alert went active, which was normal. Then it went silent, which was not normal. Silence was never the outcome of a displacement alert. Then it went to a pattern I had never heard before, 3 short tones followed by a longer one in a sequence that repeated. I did not know what that pattern meant. None of the adults around me knew what it meant, because it was the Commonwealth Standard Civilian Approach Identifier, and the Commonwealth was 400 years away, and no one in the shelter had ever had reason to learn what their approach identifier sounded like. My mother was standing at the narrow window in the upper room of the administration building, looking up through the morning overcast at the shapes that were descending through the outer atmospheric layer on burn vectors that I now know, looking back with adult knowledge, were calibrated for a civilian arrival, unhurried, widespread, gentle in the particular way of ships that are designed to communicate. We are not attacking, we are arriving. 4 shapes, maintaining the spread that indicated a convoy rather than a strike formation. My mother stood there for a long time without speaking. Then she said, very quietly, not to me specifically but to the room, "Those are not compact ships." They were not. The first communication from the convoy arrived on the General Emergency Channel 43 minutes after their entry into the outer atmosphere. It was in a language none of our comms operators recognized. The convoy's communications officer, Dross, had anticipated this and had prepared a translation packet in the 3 most common outer sector contact languages, none of which the Vethrani used. The process of establishing a working channel took 47 minutes and involved considerable back and forth, during which the 4 convoy ships held their positions in high orbit with a patience that the official record describes as notable, and which I think of as characteristically Terran. They had come 400 years in response to a 400-year-old signal, and they were not going to be rushed by a 47-minute translation delay. During those 47 minutes, the Orseth fleet generated increasingly urgent traffic on all its normal communication channels. I reviewed those intercepts later, when I had access to the full archival record. The Orseth commanders were, the intercepts make clear, conducting a rapid and not entirely stable reassessment of the situation. 4 ships of unknown origin and capabilities had entered the system without prior notice and were holding a position that interposed them between the Orseth fleet's forward elements and Vethran Prime's remaining orbital platform. They were not compact ships. They were not any fleet the Orsith commanders had a record of in this sector. Their origin beacon identified them as Terran Commonwealth, which was a designation the Orsith commanders had records of in an entirely different sector, at an entirely different scale of conflict, and which was not supposed to be here. The working channel was established. The voice that came through was Haran Yass's, translated by a system that handled formal register better than colloquial, but was accurate enough. This is Senior Logistics Officer Yass of the Terran Commonwealth 3rd Sector Relief Convoy. We received a distress encoding originating from the surface of Vethrani Prime. We are here in response to that encoding. Please advise us of your current priority needs. Governor Arvith Coral was in the Situation Room on the upper floor of the administration building when that message came through. He had been in the Situation Room since the displacement alert, which put him there before the approach identifiers had been decoded, and before anyone in the building had a confident understanding of what they were looking at. My mother was in the Situation Room as a junior staff member. She has told me about what happened next many times over the years, in increasing detail as I grew older, and the full context of what she was describing became comprehensible to me. She was standing near the back of the room, near enough to see Coral's face when Yass's message came through, far enough back that she was not in the direct field of his attention. Coral listened to the translation twice. Then he said to the room, "What distress encoding?" Nobody answered immediately, because nobody in the room knew. The siege was in its 430th year. No official distress encoding had been sent that any current staff member could account for. The compact requests were documented and on record, but none of them were recent enough to have produced a response from the Terran Commonwealth, and none of them had been sent to the Terran Commonwealth, which was not a signatory to any of the relevant compact mechanisms. Coral asked the senior archivist to check the full distress-adjacent communications record, which was a broader category than official distress requests. It included anything logged under emergency, crisis, or urgent transmission classifications going back to the beginning of the siege. That review took 11 minutes. What it produced was not in the emergency, crisis, or urgent transmission classifications. What it produced was in Sarath Ondevil's personal correspondence file. Under a subdirectory, the archivist later described as the governor's private ceremonial records, which held the records of formal rites conducted in the governor's office rather than in the public ceremonial chambers. It had been filed there because Sarath had tagged it as a personal transmission, because that was what it was. The archivist brought the document to Coral. He read it in the Situation Room while Yass's convoy held its position in high orbit and the Orsith intercepts grew more urgent. My mother told me that the room was very quiet while he read. She told me she could not see the document from where she was standing, but she could see Coral's face, and she said his expression went through several states that she had not seen on it before in all the years she had worked for him. She described it as the expression of a man encountering something that his administrative frameworks were not designed to accommodate, but who was proceeding toward accommodation anyway because he was the kind of person who proceeded. He finished reading. He set the document down carefully as though it had a weight that was not proportional to its size. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, to no one in particular, "She sent it on the ancestor band." The senior archivist confirmed this. Coral said, "She sent it to the dead." He picked up the comm. He said, "Officer Yass, this is Governor Coral. My apologies for the delay in response. Our situation is as follows, and I will be as complete as I can given the translation constraints." He gave Yass the situation, the siege count, the Orsith's position and the nature of their demand, the status of the orbital platforms, the outer settlement casualties, the inner settlement displacement numbers. He was precise and complete, and the translation system managed his precision well enough, and when he finished, Yass asked 3 clarifying questions and then said, "Understood. We will begin our approach for planetfall." The medical transport will establish surface operations at your designation. Please transmit your priority landing coordinates. The Orseth fleet did not contest the planetfall. The naval escort frigate's position in the formation had been, the intercepts make clear, a persuasive element of the Orseth commander's recalculation. The Commonwealth's flag carried implications in this sector that the Orseth's strategic planning had not adequately weighted, and the risk assessment that the commanders were now conducting in real time was arriving at conclusions that favored withdrawal over confrontation. They began their withdrawal 6 hours after the convoy's planetfall. It was not fast, and it was not graceful, and it was not accompanied by any communication to the Vethrani, which Coral noted in the official record with a restraint that I think conceals a specific flavor of satisfaction. I met Alina Dross on her 3rd day on Vethrani Prime. She had been through 2 formal briefings with the governor's staff by then, and a long session with the archivists, who were in a state of scholarly excitement that made them energetic company but not especially efficient, and she had been given what I understood to be a quiet and not entirely comfortable amount of time to sit with the full text of Sarath's journal entry from the 417th day of the siege, which the senior archivist had provided in translation. I was young enough that my role in the meeting was to sit near the back and take notes, a function I had been assigned because I was an Endeval, and my mother felt that the Endeval line had an obligation to be present at this particular meeting, and because I was old enough to hold a stylus and young enough to stay quiet. I sat in the back of the room and I watched Dross, who sat across the table from my mother and 2 of the senior staff, and I noted the way she held herself, not formal exactly, but contained, in the manner of someone who had given a great many briefings and had learned to occupy the space of a briefing room without filling it. I asked her afterward, during the informal part of the meeting when the senior staff had gone to collect the documentation she needed to sign, a question I had been holding since the convoy arrived. Did you know what it was? When you flagged it, when you decided to plot the coordinates instead of filing it away, did you understand what you were looking at? She looked at me for a moment in the way that adults assess whether a child's question is a child's question or something more substantial. She said, I knew it was a call for help. Not in those words, the notation system was not familiar to me at that point, and the full translation came later from your archivists, but the structural markers were there. The coordinates, the duration count, the signal length and the way it was organized. Those are the things you include when you need something and you want something to know where you are and how long you have been waiting. She paused. That's what a distress call is in any notation system. Someone saying, I am here. I have been here for this long. I need something. I said, but she was not saying it to anyone. Dross said, she was saying it in a format that Outer Station 7 was built to receive. She was sending it on a frequency that has the structural signature of distress. We built that station to listen on that frequency because we also use it. We have sent the same kind of signal in our own notation on our own frequency, in circumstances where we also needed something and also did not know if anything was listening. She was quiet for a moment. She was not sending it to Earth, but she was sending the same thing we send when we use the chaplain band. I don't think that changes what it was. I have thought about that answer for a long time. What I have come to understand is that she was describing something true about the specific topology of that kind of grief, which is that it is not addressed. Addressed grief goes to a named recipient. It goes to the living who remain, to the community that shares the loss, to the successor who must carry forward what the dead carried. But the grief that goes on the ancestor band is different. It goes to no one named. It goes in the direction of the dead, which is a direction and not a destination, and what it carries is not a message so much as a declaration. This happened, I am marking it, the weight of it is real. Earth built infrastructure to receive that kind of signal because they also send it. They send it on their own frequency, in their own notation, and they have been sending it since before they had the capacity to leave their own system. When they built the capacity to leave their own system, they did not stop building chaplain band infrastructure. They built it further out because they went further out, and the further they went, the more they had to mark. Outer Station 7 exists because the humans who were living and dying in that region of space needed somewhere to send the weight of what they were carrying, and they built the infrastructure for it, and they kept running it, and they never turned it off. The reason they never turned it off, Dross told me, was not oversight. It was intentional. She said, "We keep the old frequencies running because we also send signals that we're not sure will reach anyone. We don't know what's out there on the receiving end. We don't know if anyone has built the equivalent of Outer Station 7 at the other end of a frequency we've been broadcasting on for 500 years. We keep the infrastructure running because we want to give whatever is out there the same chance that Outer Station 7 gave yours." She said, and occasionally, rarely but occasionally, the signal has coordinates. The convoy departed Vethrani Prime after 43 days. Harun Yas was a logistics officer with a delivery schedule and a convoy he needed to return to port, and he had done what he came to do, and he was done. He accepted a brief formal statement of thanks from Governor Coral, signed the paperwork the Commonwealth's protocols required, and scheduled his ships for departure on the morning of the 44th day. The departure was not ceremonial, despite the attempts of our protocol office to make it otherwise. Yas was polite about those attempts and unmoved by them. He shook Coral's hand in the manner of a man who shakes hands efficiently, and for whom the act is completed when the hands separate. He said, "You have our contact information. If the situation changes, use it." He said this in a tone that contained no ambiguity about what using it would mean. The medical transport left last. It had been on the surface the longest. Its staff had moved between the outer settlements for 3 weeks, and the withdrawal of the transport's operations was a more complex logistical matter than the supply carrier's departure. It cleared the outer atmosphere on the morning of the 44th day on a burn vector that took it directly over the position where the second orbital platform had been, an area of space that was still marked on the navigation charts with the standard notation for a decommissioned structure that had been the subject of significant action. Whether that route was intentional, I have never been able to confirm. The convoy's navigation logs, which the Commonwealth shared with us as part of the contact documentation, do not provide enough detail to determine whether the burn vector was chosen for operational reasons or for something else. I have asked Dross. She said she did not know, and her expression when she said it suggested that she did know, but that it was not her information to give. Yas's official report, filed on the return journey, categorized the Vethrani engagement under the Commonwealth's administrative designation for unscheduled relief operations responding to unaddressed distress signals, a category that covers a range of situations in which a response has been dispatched to a signal that was not addressed to Commonwealth authorities. The remarks field contains a recommendation that Sarath's ancient notation system be added to Outer Station 7's pattern recognition library, and that other liturgical and ceremonial frequencies used by species in this sector be assessed for structural similarity to known distress formats. The recommendation was approved and implemented within the year. It is now in the library. I confirmed this with Dross, who had been involved in the technical specification for the library update. I have been governor for 9 years. I hold Sarath's chair and I keep Sarath's records. I sign the procurement authorizations and the damage assessments and the session minutes, and I hold the governing council meetings with the procedural formality that the office requires and the tradition demands. I have not been tested the way she was tested, and I do not know that I would hold the same way if I were. I hope I would. I am not sure hope is evidence. The convoy's visit changed the protectorate in ways that are still working themselves out. The Commonwealth contact is documented and formalized, and the treaty that covers the relationship is in the archive with the proper signatures. The outer settlements were rebuilt in the decade after the siege. The orbital platforms were upgraded. The Orsith have maintained their distance, as organizations that have made the wrong calculation and been permitted to recognize the error tend to do for a generation or two. These are all in the official record. The official record is complete, and I have kept it well. What is not in the official record is what I think about when the session is done and the staff have gone, and the building is quiet, and I sit with the waveform on the wall. The waveform is framed on the wall of this office, not the original document, which is in the archive, but a print that Dross gave me personally on the last morning of the convoy's stay. It is rendered on Terran stock paper in the Terran notation format, and it shows Sarath's signal as Outer Station 7 received it. The complex layered waveform of the ancient notation system, the liturgical passage encoded in the wave harmonics, the declaration of ongoing life, the coordinates, and at the end, the name. If you know what you are looking at, you can see the shape of grief in that waveform. The ancient notation was built to carry specific kinds of weight, and the weight shapes the signal, and the signal is still there in the print on the wall, 400 years later, exactly as Outer Station 7 received it. I think about the 47 minutes it took to establish the working channel, and the 43 days the convoy spent here, and the 412 years the signal spent traveling. I think about Alina Dross at the early shift with her cold coffee, and the decision she made about whether to plot the coordinates or file the anomaly. I think about how close it came to being filed. I think about the fact that there is no version of this story in which Sarath knew. She sent the signal into a void she had no reason to believe was populated. She sent it for herself, for the tradition, for Desith's name, not for Earth. And yet, 12 other species in the outer sectors use liturgical or ceremonial frequencies that Outer Station 7's pattern library now recognizes as structurally similar to the Vethrani ancestor band. Several of them have used those frequencies in contexts that included coordinates and duration counts and names. Dross told me this 3 years ago at a Commonwealth Relations meeting, in a tone that was not casual. She said the pattern library update had, since its implementation, flagged 6 signals from other species that the old library would have categorized as anomalous non-standard transmissions and routed to the long-term archive without priority forwarding. I asked her what had happened with those 6 signals. She said 3 of them had coordinates that resolved to systems without active distress conditions. 2 of them had coordinates that resolved to systems that had been in distress at the time of transmission, but had since resolved the situation through other means, and the Commonwealth had made contact and provided a report to the relevant parties. One of them, she said, was ongoing. She did not tell me more than that, and I did not ask. It was not my situation to involve myself in. But I think about it. I think about whoever sent that signal, in whatever notation they use for the dead, on whatever frequency their tradition calls the ancestor band, into whatever void they believed was empty on the other side. I think about whether they have been sending it for a long time, the way the Vethrani sent it for centuries before Sarath sent it, the way you continue doing the things the tradition asks of you even when the return has been silence. I think about Outer Station 7 receiving it. I think about whether there is a comms officer on shift somewhere who has just plotted the coordinates and is looking at a system they did not expect to find at the other end of a liturgical frequency. I hope there is. I think that is the right word for what I feel about it. Hope. Not certainty, not confidence. Hope. The hope that the infrastructure runs in both directions. The hope that what was built to catch one kind of grief can catch another kind. The hope that somewhere out there, in the direction of a frequency that was never supposed to reach anyone, there is something that has been listening long enough to know what to do with coordinates. Sarath did not know they were listening. She sent her signal into a void and received silence and went back to the reports. She held the session. She moved to the next item. She did not break. She died 31 years after the siege ended, having served the office for longer than anyone could have asked her to, having kept the records and the session schedule and the procedural formality through conditions that required her to keep them. She did not know that what she sent was received. She did not know that 412 years later, a convoy would arrive in answer to it. She did not know about Outer Station 7 or about the chaplain band, or about the particular mathematical coincidence of grief frequencies that made her signal legible to a machine that was never designed to read Vethrani liturgy. She just knew that Deceth had died and that the tradition asked her to mark it, and she marked it in the way the tradition prescribed, which was to send his name out on the ancestor band in the ancient notation with the coordinates attached, because the tradition had been built by people who understood that grief without direction is only half of what grief needs to be. The other half is the coordinates. The other half is the declaration. I am still here, at this location, on this day, in this count. That is what a distress call is, someone saying I am here. I have been here for this long, I need something. She was not calling anyone. She was just being precise about where she was. Earth, it turned out, was listening for that kind of precision. I filed that in the record under Sarath's name, where she put it, in the subdirectory of the governor's private ceremonial records, alongside the Encoder log and the formal notation of the rite. It is not an official communication. It is not a treaty document. It is not administrative correspondence. It is a private word sent into a room she believed was empty. The room was not empty. The room had been listening, on the right frequency, with the right infrastructure, for longer than either of them knew. That is the whole of the story. Sarath did not call Earth. Earth was not the intended recipient. What Sarath sent was grief in the ancient notation, addressed to the dead, and Earth decoded it as distress, which it also was, and Earth came anyway, which is the part I keep returning to when the session is done, and the building is quiet and the waveform is on the wall. Earth came anyway. 412 years later, across a frequency that was not supposed to reach anyone, in response to a signal that was sent to no one in particular, with a 3-ship convoy and a hospital and a naval escort, whose presence made the Orseth commanders reconsider their options very quickly. Earth came anyway. I have held this chair for 9 years. I have 9 more years, probably, before the successor question becomes pressing, and I intend to spend those years keeping the records and holding the sessions and moving to the next item on the agenda. That is the tradition. That is what the chair requires. But I have also, since I took the chair, maintained one practice that is not in the administrative tradition. On the anniversary of the day the convoy arrived, I take the portable encoder from the cabinet, the same encoder that Sarath used, the same dark casing, the same ancient notation keypad, cleaned and preserved and fully functional, and I sit at this desk, and I encode the declaration of ongoing life in the full liturgical format, with the coordinates of Vethran Prime and the current count of days since the siege ended, and I broadcast it on the ancestor band. Not because I think anyone is listening, not because I expect a reply. Because the tradition asks it, and because the coordinates are attached, and because on the very small chance that somewhere out there on the ancestor band there is a machine that has been listening for the right kind of precision, I wanted to know that we are still here, and that we remember. Sarath sent the same signal into the same silence, and received the same nothing, and went back to the reports. 43 years after she died, a convoy arrived. I do not know what will arrive 43 years after I am gone. I do not know what the frequency carries, or how far it goes, or what is listening at the other end. I know that the room is not always empty. I know that sometimes the coordinates are enough. I file the record, and I go back to the reports. There is one more thing I have not set down here, and I should, because it belongs to the record. In the 3rd year after the convoy's departure, the Commonwealth sent a follow-up delegation, not Yas, who had returned to his logistics posting, but a diplomatic liaison team of 4, led by a career contact specialist named Bren Orvash, whose job was to formalize the relationship that the convoy had improvised. Orvash was a different kind of Terran from Yas or Dross. Where Yas had been efficient and Dross had been precise, Orvash was patient in a way that suggested long practice with the gap between what civilizations intend to communicate and what they actually communicate when they are conducting it through a translation system. He spent 6 days in this building, in the meeting rooms and the record archive and the council chamber, and on the last day he sat in this office across from Governor Coral, and the two of them worked through the final language of the contact framework. I was not present for that meeting. I was 10 years old and had no official function, but my mother was present, again as a junior staff member, and she has described it to me. The contact framework contained, at Orvash's suggestion, a clause that had not been in any of the initial draft language. The clause formalized the Terran Commonwealth's acknowledgement that the signal it had responded to was a liturgical transmission rather than an official distress communication, and that the response the convoy represented was not predicated on any official request from the Vethrani Protectorate, and that the relationship going forward would proceed on the basis of the Commonwealth's independent decision to respond rather than on any implied obligation arising from a signal that was not addressed to them. Coral had read the clause twice. He had looked at Orvash. He had said, "Why does this language matter to you?" Orvash had said, "Because we want you to understand that we did not come because we were asked. We came because we heard a signal that indicated a population in distress, and the signal had coordinates, and that combination is sufficient justification for a Commonwealth response under our protocols. We are not asking you to be grateful for fulfilling an obligation you did not ask us to fulfill. We are asking you to understand that this is what we do when that combination of factors is present, and that the relationship going forward does not require you to have asked." Coral had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "And if we send the signal again? If something like this happens again, and we broadcast on the ancestor band for the same reason Sarath did, for a private reason, in an empty room, you want us to understand that you would respond again?" Orvash had said, "We would respond again, yes." Coral had said, "Without being asked." Orvash had said, "Without being asked." My mother said that the room was quiet for a long moment after that. Coral looked at the clause language. He looked at Orvash. He signed the document. "That clause is in the archive. I have read it many times. It is, in my view, the most important single piece of language in the entire framework, and it is the piece of language I come back to when I sit at this desk in the quiet after the sessions and think about Sarath and the hymn encoder and the 412 years. Without being asked, the Orsith sent 14 formal requests through official channels and received expressions of deep concern and liaison officers, and nothing that counted. Sarath sent a private grief into the void in a notation system that had been obsolete for 4 centuries, addressed to no one, expecting nothing, and 412 years later 4 ships came and the Orsith went home. I have thought about what the difference is. I have thought about it for a long time. The honest answer, the one I believe is actually true, is this. The 14 formal requests went to organizations that were calculating the cost of responding. The ancestor band signal went, eventually, to an organization that had built infrastructure specifically for the purpose of receiving that kind of signal, and had staffed that infrastructure with people whose job was to plot the coordinates before they filed the anomaly. The difference was not in the urgency of the request or the legitimacy of the need or the formality of the channel. The difference was whether the receiver was built to respond. Outer Station 7 was built to respond. It was built in the old period of human expansion, during the time when the humans were sending their own grief into the void on their own chaplain band, and did not know what was on the receiving end, and they built the station because they wanted to give whatever was out there the same chance they were hoping for. They built the infrastructure of response before they knew they would ever receive anything. They kept it running for centuries because they kept hoping. And one morning on the early shift, an obsolete liturgical broadcast from a siege planet 400 light-years away arrived in the queue of a comms officer with a cup of cold coffee and the professional habit of plotting coordinates, and the infrastructure was ready. That is what I think about. That is what I keep coming back to, in the quiet after the sessions, with the waveform on the wall. The room was not empty. It had been built by people who sent the same signal into the same kind of void, to be the kind of room that listens.